So the Philistines are gathered together. That's where we left things last week. They have moved up north. The region mentioned here, Aphek, is not known, but we know it's somewhere near Shunem that we were highlighting a bit last week. The Israelites on the other side of the valley of Jezreel are on Mount Gilboa. We're picking up after the incident described last week with Saul going to this woman at Endor. She's traditionally called the Witch of Endor, and so that's the term I'm using, though some people might not think that's quite complimentary to her, but nevertheless that's the term that's commonly used. So now this is the next day. This is the morning of, and we have the interesting story that plays out as these who are part of the army of the Philistines are gathered together, and it's discovered that among them are these Hebrew soldiers. We're right here. The valley of Jezreel separates on the north Shunem, and presumably Aphek is somewhere there, an unknown location, and Mount Gilboa on the south. So the lords of the Philistines passed in review by hundreds and thousands, but David and his men passed in review at the rear with Achish. Then the princes said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" There's an interesting little distinction that's subtle and easy to miss, but you'll notice a difference between the reference to the lords of the Philistines and those who are called the princes of the Philistines. And people who've looked at this closely note that the word lords is actually referring to civil leaders, political leaders, if you will, whereas princes refers more to military commanders. So there's a difference here in the Philistine economy between civil authority and military authority. And that in itself is rather surprising because it would be quite unusual at that time in history. Generally speaking, military command represented the ultimate command in the society, but here we have the Philistines with a kind of working difference between those two regimes. We in America have the difference between military and civil authority simply to prevent a kind of military dictatorship from ever arising. It's built into our Constitution. At this time in history, it would be much more rare. And it's led people to note that the Philistines were quite a bit more sophisticated than we typically give them credit for. You know, you'll sometimes hear the term Philistine used as if someone were an unsophisticated, backwards Neanderthal rube. You know, that term, that guy's such a Philistine, you've heard that expression. Well, not so much. These people were actually ahead of the game. Pretty sophisticated in the way that they had arranged their social order. It does appear to represent a Greek influence, and there has been other evidence that Mycenaeans were among these Philistines, and that might represent something of their impact on the society as well. One way or another, they don't like the presence of these Hebrews, as they call them. It's kind of a pejorative way of stating it, as the grammar expresses it. So the princes, these military commanders, now discovering that Achish has Hebrews as part of his own contingent, were angry with him. So the princes of the Philistines said to him, "Make this fellow return, that he can go back to the place that you've appointed for him. Don't let him go down with us to the battle, lest in the battle he become our adversary. For with what could he reconcile himself to his master, if not with the heads of these men?" Referring to their own forces. "Is this not David, of whom they sang to one another, saying, 'Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands'?" Interesting little trivial point there. The term adversary is the Hebrew word Satan. That is the meaning of that word, and so when we hear that Satan is our adversary, in some ways that's actually a comment or an application of the very meaning of the word itself. The Philistines didn't want David to become a Satan among them, you know, and to turn coat in the middle of the battle and catch them when they may have been vulnerable. Everybody in the Philistine world thought that David was a rebel. That was the common view. David had tried to unsuccessfully, did I lose it? Sorry for that little mishap, but there was a common view among the Philistines that David was a rebel, that David had tried to mount a coup and it had been unsuccessful. and that Saul had therefore driven him out. The view was that David, having been run out, was probably keen to reconcile himself to Saul, and what better way to do that than to, in the middle of the battle, of course, turn against those who were the stated enemies and turn back against the Philistines themselves. This idea that David was a rebel was, of course, false. David had never rebelled. It was Saul's jealousy that had driven David out, not any rebellious action on the part of David, but from the Philistine point of view, that subtlety was lost on them. Achish thought, well, this makes David loyal to us. But these others thought, no, David may be angling to get back into the good graces of the king against whom he rebelled, and so they see it in a different perspective, and thus we have a difference of opinion. And they remind Achish of the little ditty that had been popular in Israel once upon a time concerning those slain by Saul and those that had been killed by David. We've looked at that before. Well, Achish is overruled, outnumbered. Achish called David and said to him, "Surely as the Lord lives, you have been upright, and your going out and your coming in with me in the army is good in my sight. For to this day I have not found evil in you since the day of your coming to me. Nevertheless, the lords do not favor you. Therefore return now, go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." Interesting, when Achish makes this statement, he swears, and he swears in the name of David's own God, not in the names of his own Philistine gods, indicating even in this respect, Achish has come to respect David, at least to some degree, in terms of his religious outlook. He says he hasn't found any fault in David. This is another. It really suggests the charisma that must have been associated with David. I think we've all met people in our lives, and we just were immediately so impressed with their bearing, with their what appears to be self-possession, with their confidence, with their general persona, what we commonly call their charisma, that we just feel like, yeah, we'd follow them anywhere. You know, whatever they say, we'd be willing to do it. We just have that kind of attraction to them. And it seems that David must have been something like that. Shall we give it a try here? So anyway, we have this idea that Achish had really been drawn in by David, believed in him, believed he could trust him. It speaks interesting things about David, that even here, when at least arguably he's feeling a little distant from the Lord God of Israel, he's out of the promised land, he's away from what he calls the inheritance of the Lord, he's out here, as he said to Saul himself, being forced to worship the wrong gods. Even here, David still has that kind of natural attractiveness about him that Achish seems to be reflecting in his statements. David said to Achish, "What have I done? And to this day, what have you found in your servant, as long as I've been with you, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" It's an interesting statement by David. You parse it and you realize he's being somewhat ambiguous. We don't know quite who David is referring to when he says, "my lord the king." Achish, of course, construes it in the light most favorable to himself. Maybe David is in fact thinking of his Lord the King, the anointed one of Israel. David is kind of playing both sides of the fence here a little bit. Maybe he was contemplating doing the very thing that Achish is defending him of. If that is true, then David is not only a man of great charisma, he's also a great con man, you know. We don't know. And this is where the text itself leaves us a little bit, well, at least slightly confused as to what David would have done. My personal feeling is David was really relieved to be off the hook, that he had to go home. I don't know if he'd quite mapped out a plan yet. What was he going to do? It's unthinkable that he would have gone to battle against his own people. At the same time, his host, Achish, had treated him well. He was going to be betraying him. I think David probably was feeling pretty uneasy in this moment. And now to be able to, without having had to make any particular decision about it, be driven away, may have just been what gave him a sigh of relief. I don't know. People differ on that. You can land where you want on it, but I think probably that's the way David viewed it. Achish answered and said to David, I know that you are as good in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the princes of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us into the battle. So Achish, overruled by higher authorities, is urging David on his way, even though Achish has no complaint whatsoever against David, has never suspected that David is playing a game with him. He's really been taken in fully by David and his ability to persuade Achish in that way. So he continues, now therefore rise early in the morning with your master's servants who have come with you. As soon as you are up early in the morning and have light, depart. So David and his men rose early to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So Achish is urging David to leave early in the morning. He says it several times. Leave early, first thing, morning light, get going. I think even Achish, though he trusted David, realized that what he had just done from David's point of view was a slap in the face. That this would be quite an indignity for David, who's now all dressed up and ready to go to battle with his men, to be pushed away, treated with contempt by the other Philistine lords, is an insult. And at that time, in that day, and throughout much of history, when a person is insulted, they're expected to take reprisals. And Achish realized that David, whatever else he was a soldier, was a warrior, was a commander, was a successful military personality, and that he would not take a slight easily. This was, of course, what provoked the attack on Nabal that was only at the last minute prevented by the intervening work of Abigail, the story we looked at a couple of weeks ago. I think Achish was a little worried that though he trusted David, David might still wake up in the morning and not take action against Achish, but maybe some of these other jerks, you see, who were sending him home. And so Achish wants to get him going right away to avoid that. David, for his part, probably wasn't thinking of doing anything like that. He was glad to get going, and so he leaves. It's about a 3-day journey. They're up in the north of Israel, near the Sea of Galilee. So it's going to take a couple of days to get back to Gath, the hometown of Achish, and then another day to get to Ziklag, which is 50 miles to the south. We have 2 stories now. We have the story of David returning to Ziklag, and we have at the same time the story of Saul going to battle against these Philistines. And we're going to try to cover both this morning. It's a big piece of text to chew, but we'll see how we do. So anyway, first of all, we go along with David. It happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day that the Amalekites had invaded the south, and Ziklag attacked Ziklag and burned it with fire. So 3 days out, it took him 3 days to get back, and now he arrives and discovers that what he had been dishing out to the Amalekites, they have just returned the favor. He's been doing raiding parties against them for some time, giving them some grief, and now they give him some of his own medicine. And so they come, and not only do they plunder this unprotected town of Ziklag, but they take the people, take the property, and then just to add insult to injury, they burn everything to the ground. This area that we're looking at is to the southern part of this map. So Amalek, you see, is indicated there. They do a sweeping campaign against a region that apparently was pretty much unprotected. Nobody home at the time. That is to say, none of the fighting men were home. Everybody's up north getting ready to meet the Philistines. Even David has taken his men north. So Ziklag is unprotected, the Negeb of Judah is unprotected, and the attack by the Amalekites, therefore, is sort of a sweeping raiding party that is very lucrative, very successful, because they're not meeting any resistance. And now David has come home to find the results of that. It's not a battle or a war, it's just kind of a raid that was probably unexpectedly successful from the Amalekites' point of view. So here come David and his men, 3 days' journey, looking forward to getting home, and here now they arrive. They find that they had taken captive the women and those who were there, from small to great. They didn't kill anyone, but they carried them away and went their way. So David and his men came to the city, and there it was, burned with fire. And their wives and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's 2 wives, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite, had been taken captive. There's deep pathos, of course, in this text. They didn't kill anyone. They probably, when they first arrived, were looking frantically for bodies. No bodies. The place was vacant. And they knew immediately the intention, which would have been the standard Amalekite practice and others of the same ilk in that region, to take people down to Egypt and sell them in the slave markets there. And so their sons, their daughters, their wives, their families were all being hauled away, as it were, in chains, down to Egypt, where they were going to be traded in the slave markets, and would really be almost impossible to retrieve if they ever made it there. To add insult to injury, the city had been burned with fire. You can imagine what these people went through. They're on the 3rd day, leaving Gath, heading the 50 miles down, kind of forcing themselves. It's a lot of territory to cover in a day, 50 miles. They're anxious to get home, they're pushing themselves, and then as they approach, they begin to see a little smoke on the horizon, and a funny feeling in the pit of their stomach as they begin to realize maybe something isn't quite right. And the closer they get, the more they realize what a catastrophe has befallen them. And finally, when they arrive, these fighting men, these men who had been all ready to go into battle just a couple of days earlier, now find that home base has been completely destroyed, and they, of course, are thrust into what has to be incalculable grief, so that the pathos of the description is really moving. They wept and wept until they were too tired even to weep. They arrived at the end of the day, and this is what they encountered, and this is the emotion that's described. Some of you in this room, I suppose, at times have been at a point due to a set of circumstances where you feel like you wept and wept till you had no more power to weep. And in some ways, we're supposed to gather from this that God knows about that. That this is not a random universe that just because of the luck of the draw dealt you a bad hand, but that even in these circumstances, God is with you. And we're supposed to learn that by looking at what happens with David, who is joining these people, weeping till he had no power to weep. In some ways, David is here, maybe, arguably, because a set of circumstances for which he was partly responsible have brought him here. Sometimes it happens and it was not any fault of your own or anybody else's. It just happens. But one way or another, the lesson we learn is that in those circumstances, God is not absent. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and his daughters. You know how it works. Hurt turns to anger. Sometimes we say hurtful things. Sometimes we have hurtful things said to us. How often is it the case that the hurt that we feel transforms itself pretty quickly into anger? And the hurt, of course, becomes a desire to hurt back, energized by anger. David, we were just saying, was a man of remarkable charisma, attractiveness. But here this man who had such attractiveness, such charisma, we discover had really pretty slender control of these people over whom he was the captain. He didn't have an official appointment. He had no official status. He only had the leadership role because everybody was willing to follow him. But now he's run out. Now that authority is pretty thin. The charisma seems to have been drained out. And the very people who were willing to follow him anywhere are talking about executing him, stoning him. Why? Because he'd left the city defenseless. What a stupid thing to do. You took everybody away. You know that the Amalekite, what's the matter with you? You can imagine the level of outrage that these guys begin to pour out on David. You idiot, look what you did. And all of a sudden, all that's happened is David's fault. He's the one who told them all to get ready to go to battle. He's the one who left the place vacant, left these people vulnerable. It's his fault. And how lonely can a man feel when he's faced with this catastrophe and it's all his fault? And David at that point, of course, felt very much, I suppose, as alone as he ever felt any time in his career. He always had people who rallied to him. For the first time, I think probably David realized he had nobody. Nobody. And that last line, therefore, is deeply significant. But David strengthened himself in the Lord. It's the first time since David has been in the world of the Philistines that we get a little hint of him turning his heart back toward where it's supposed to be. Now again, you realize there's debate on this, and I'm not being dogmatic about it, but it seems to me that David, who had said to Saul himself, "You're forcing me into a pagan place. You're forcing me to a place where the pagan gods rule. You're forcing me away from Israel, from the presence of God, from the inheritance of the Lord. You're forcing me out there to that place which is dark." That even David felt a little bit isolated, a little bit cut off, wondering if God could be accessed in this pagan land, wondering if there was actually a way to reach the deity here. But now when he's utterly alone, everything's against him. Everything's coming crashing down. The only thing he can go to and the only place he can turn is to this God from whom he has felt somewhat distant, at least apparently, for some time. Some of you were here years and years ago when Dick Leon was here, and I remember once him mentioning in a sermon an experience he had when he was a young Christian, in his early 20s, and he, for various circumstances, wound up in India, in rural India, more or less by himself for a couple of years. And he said, as a young Christian, he had never felt more separated, more isolated from everything that represented that which he could depend on. He felt like nothing. It was dark. He used the terms like oppression, darkness, loneliness, crushing feeling of isolation. He said it was the only time in his life he ever had the thought of suicide flash through his mind. It was so hard to be there. And he talked in that sermon about how he discovered there that the only place you can really turn in those circumstances is to the Lord. I think he may have actually used this text as the basis for that particular point. This is what we have when we have nothing. Corrie ten Boom, of course, famously said, "You'll only learn Jesus is all you need when Jesus is all you have." And she learned that, of course, in a concentration camp under the Nazis. I think David was feeling a little bit of that here. And for us, it signals a bit of a turning point, of course, for David. Then David said, now here's David, in a sense, taking the lead. He's been weeping with everybody else, crushed, but now at this point we see a little bit of a different David showing up. David said to Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, "Bring the ephod here to me." Abiathar brought the ephod to David. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I pursue this troop? Shall I overtake them?" And he answered him, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. This is a rather mysterious thing. The Hebrew oracle, as it's called, came through various means, one of which was called the priestly ephod, which apparently was where the Urim and the Thummim, those jewels apparently, were affixed, and that became part of the way in which you could access the so-called oracle, to ask questions and get answers. And when we hear in the text that David inquired of the Lord, that typically is the way that's construed. David probably hasn't done this for a couple of years, you see. He's not sure that anybody's home. But now, strengthened in the Lord, he's prepared to take once again that leadership role, and he inquires of the Lord and gets this confirmation. He finds out that the oracle works if you're in the land of the Philistines. It doesn't become defunct. The batteries don't run out like mine did a few minutes ago. It actually functions even when you're out there in the hinterland. Even when you feel like nobody's home, God is there. And so he accesses through the oracle now, this which becomes an affirming message to David that he would overtake them. So the change of heart leads to a change of action. So David went. He and the 600 men who were with him came to the brook Besor, where those stayed who were left behind. But David pursued, he and the 400 men, for 200 stayed behind. They were so weary they could not cross the brook. The word brook there, the Hebrew word, actually can mean, and actually primarily does mean, a torrent. So apparently this brook was sort of in a flood stage right now, and it's right here. It's on the way to Egypt. It apparently is the route that had been taken by the Amalekites earlier. 200 of these guys, after a 3-day march, after weeping till they couldn't weep anymore, and now going out in hot pursuit of Hadad, they have no more strength, and they're left behind. 200 of them on the other side of that brook, while 400 follow David across, going out in pursuit of these Amalekites. Then they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David. And they gave him bread and he ate, and they gave him water and he drank. And they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. When he had eaten, his strength came back to him, for he had eaten no bread and drunk no water for 3 days and 3 nights. We learn this was an Egyptian slave who was left to die by his Amalekite master 3 days ago. So they've got a 3-day head start at this point. And so this man is brought now for interrogation by David. David asks him, "Who do you belong to? Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm a young man from Egypt, servant of an Amalekite. My master left me behind because 3 days ago I fell sick." So his slave status becomes apparent. The word for sick is actually the word for faint. So he wasn't really ill apparently, but he just had run out of gas. And his Amalekite master thought he was too much trouble to hang on to, just left him to die. And so that's how he was found 3 days later. The irony, of course, pointed out by one commentator, it was the Amalekites' inhumanity to one of their least that led to their own destruction, because as it turns out, this Amalekite slave is actually able to point the way that was commonly used by these to go to Egypt. He says, "We made an invasion of the southern area of the Kerethites in the territory which belongs to Judah, and the southern area of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." The Kerethites have always been a bit mysterious, but the best thought is that they actually were Minoans. After the collapse of the Minoan Empire several hundred years earlier, these Cretes, they were from the island of Crete, hence they were called Kerethites, had spread throughout the ancient Near East. Some became the elite bodyguards for David, kind of like the Swiss that defend the Vatican. You know, you see those guys there if you've been to Italy and Rome. Well, that's kind of what these guys became. They were foreigners, but they became David's most trusted bodyguards. They had a region that was attacked. They attacked the region of Caleb, which was eventually absorbed into Judah. And of course, especially important, they had attacked and destroyed Ziklag. David said to him, "Can you take me down to this troop?" The man said, "Swear to me by God that you will neither kill me nor deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this troop." He presumably knows the route. He's an Egyptian. He's probably been back and forth more than once. He knows the way that they're probably going to take. He's afraid David is going to treat him the same way that his master did, so he wants an oath that David will keep him alive. David gives that oath, and there they go, catching up with them. The Amalekites had to move more slowly. They had a lot of stuff they were maneuvering. They probably didn't know they were in any peril. They thought everybody was out of town fighting battles way to the north. They thought they were pretty safe at this point. And so David finds them there, spread out over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil which they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. So the man, knowing the route, brings them to this location, finds them celebrating their success, not worried too much about any attacks or other peril that might befall them. Then David attacked them from twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. This is a little bit ambiguous in terms of the original text, and it's commonly understood that what actually happened was not an attack at twilight, but certainly the preparation for one. David mapped out a strategy, and the plan was to surprise them the next morning when they're still just barely awake, to sweep in at morning's first light and attack them suddenly and unexpectedly. And of course, it represents a great success, and most of them are slaughtered by David. Some escape, but certainly we have the best news in this, that David recovered everything. David recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away. He rescued his 2 wives. Nothing of theirs was lacking, either small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything which they had taken from them. David recovered all. We're supposed to be impressed with how unlikely this is, because you would think there'd be a little bit of loss along the way. You think there'd be some damage, you see. And so the thing that impresses us about what we hear is that much more than had been expected, they recover everything with no losses at all. And at least implied in that was this was more than genius on David's part. This was something of God's providence playing in. And that becomes quite clear a little later as the story goes along. Nothing was lacking. These people had planned to sell the people as slaves, keep the plunder for themselves. All of it is recovered by David without any loss. So David took all the flocks and herds that they had driven before and the other livestock. This all became his spoil. He doesn't keep it all personally, but he distributes it in ways that are just and serve good purposes, as we'll see. Now David came to the 200 men who had been so weary they could not follow David, whom they also had made to stay at the brook Bezor. So they went out to meet David, these people who had stayed behind. They went out to meet the people who were with him. Then David came near the people and he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men of those who went with David, he had some of those, answered and said, "Well, look, they didn't go with us. We're not going to give them anything. This spoil we recovered, it's ours, not theirs. They can have their wives and children, that's it." Even David had some rabble in his group there. We would gather that. These were the people who hadn't gone into battle. They'd stayed behind, too weary to pursue, so they had been left in charge of the goods that were left there on the other side. David, the term that's used here for greeted them, means it's a very warm greeting, presumably a greeting that was richly filled with a sense of blessing. There's no sense of disparagement on David's part concerning these, but contrary to that, these guys who were more self-interested, of course, don't have anything good to say about them. These bunch of lazy bums, they stayed back here, they weren't willing to go with us, they shouldn't get any of the proceeds of this. So you can see a lot of real humanity there. David responds, "My brothers." He does not respond, "You idiots." He doesn't. We can imagine some of the ways, but David was a master diplomat. "My brothers, you shall not do so with what the Lord has given us," what the Lord has given us, who has preserved us and delivered into our hand the troop that came against us. For who will heed you in this matter? But as his part who goes down to the battle, so shall his part be who stays by the supplies. They shall all share alike. It's a remarkable concept, and it became a rule, we'll see, in Israel. He responds to them politely, but firmly. The Septuagint puts it a little bit more of a sharp point on it. From the Septuagint, it would be translated about like this: "You must not do so after the Lord has helped us and preserved us and delivered into our hand the band that came against us." David obviously understands quite well that the success they've had is not anything other than the presence of God with them, that God can be very much present in the Philistine region or on the way to Egypt as well as he could be in Israel. And so he gently but firmly repudiates what these guys are proposing and establishes a rule that the one who stays by the supplies, the old King James says, stays by the stuff. And I heard a pastor I admired very much years ago preach a sermon entitled, "Staying by the Stuff." Isn't that a great title? It's a perfect title. And he talks about how in the history of the work of God's people, there's always been those who are sent and those who send. And for David, there are those who stay behind, stay by the stuff, and there are those who go out being sent by those who stay back with the stuff, you know. And there's a role for both of us in the economy of God. We can't all go. We should not all stay home. We should recognize our place in this great economy of serving God and realize that even in Christian service, there is that same kind of division of labor. So we all share together in the bounty of what God does through those who we help on their way. When David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the spoil to the elders of Judah and to his friends, saying, "Here's a present for you of the spoils of the enemies of the Lord." I'm going to skip by a little of this because I got way behind because of these interruptions we had. And so speed read this. It's really great stuff. And then we're going to pass right on to the next chapter. Hope you caught all that. But I've got about 10 minutes to give you about 20 minutes worth of stuff. So this is going to come by fairly quickly. But now, here we are back up north. This is the last chapter of 1 Samuel. The Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines followed hard after Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Abinadab, Malchishua, Saul's sons. So the fighting is going on. As we have this story of David happening down south, this is what's happening up north. Mount Gilboa is the northern defensive line of Israel. Saul has been on Mount Gilboa, as we saw earlier. The prior evening, he'd been in this woman at Endor, and now, as advertised, here he is the next morning on Mount Gilboa, facing the very thing that had been predicted concerning this morning's events. The battle became fierce against Saul. The archers hit him, and he was severely wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword, thrust me through, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. There's ambiguity here, and commentators divide almost evenly as to what exactly is being said, because the phrase translated, "the archers hit him," literally means the archers found him. And the phrase, "he was sore wounded," actually literally is sore distressed. It may mean he was wounded, or it may simply mean he was surrounded such that escape was utterly impossible. And so one way or another, Saul knew that it was over. His fear of being abused may have been traced back to the experience of Samson, who you recall was captured by the Philistines. They gouged his eyes out. They turned him into a beast of burden. And for 20 years, Samson lived a kind of humiliated existence there among the Philistines. The Philistines knew how to do that. And Saul would rather die on the spot than face that prospect. And so it could be that that's what he's fearing. He may or may not have been wounded at that point. That's ambiguous. But one thing we do know is that he fell on his sword. There's only 3 suicides ever recorded in the Bible. Saul is one of them. Ahithophel, who becomes a participant in the story of David later, we'll look at that on another occasion, died by suicide. And of course the third one is Judas himself. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men died that same day. There's a Jewish tradition that says the armor bearer was Doeg the Edomite. You'll remember him. They also say, in this tradition, it's not biblical, that the sword that he fell on was the sword with which he had slain 85 priests. It's not probable, but if it is true, it certainly represents a bit of poetic irony as the story finally reaches this conclusion. The statement that all of Saul's men died is hyperbole. We know that many survived. Abner, the commander of the army, survived. He actually eventually has dealings with David. Ishbosheth, the youngest son of Saul, survived. He rules over Israel for a certain period of time. But the point is, this was a huge loss for Israel and a huge victory for the Philistines. The men of Israel on the other side of the Jordan fled. They left behind the cities. They all vacated, and so the Philistines came and took over essentially the whole north half of Israel. This was a huge, breathtaking success for them and a huge loss, catastrophe, maybe the worst in Israel's history for them. So the description here is simply giving us an indication. This is very rich, fertile parts of Israel that are being lost to the Philistines. It so happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. The battle went into the evening hours. They come back the next morning to plunder the results of the success. They cut off the head and stripped off the armor of Saul, sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim it in the temple of their idols and among the people. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they fastened his body to a wall called Beth-shan. Cutting off the head was the ultimate sign of victory. David cut off the head of Goliath. This is what they do to show that they have definitely defeated this king. The temple of Ashtoreth was famous. Actually, Herodotus, writing almost 600 years later, refers to that very temple in his histories. The loot itself is divvied up among the Philistine cities and temples. Saul's head is hung in a Philistine temple. The wall of Beth-shan is apparently this one. It's right at the region where we would expect it to be. It's about 4 miles west of the Jordan, about 12 miles south of Galilee. We have an interesting, I'm just going to summarize this because time is really up. The body of Saul was rescued, as it were, by the men of Jabesh Gilead. This was the first great act of courage on Saul's part years earlier, when he was a much better man. And he had rescued them from an attack by the Ammonites, and they never forgot it. So even though Saul had more or less spun into a very dark shadow of his former greatness, nevertheless, they never forgot this man who had been heroic to them. And they went and rescued the body of Saul. They cremated it to prevent further abuse, and David will eventually congratulate them for that. All right, I'm skipping by this, and we're getting to the end. I want to remind you, if you were here last week, of the last thing that Saul said to David. The last time they met. And of course, David had spared Saul's life again. If you were here, you recall that story. And then David and Saul have that last conversation, and the conclusion of the conversation was when Saul said to David, "I have played the fool." You know, the great summary statement of the way in which Saul had acted toward David is distilled into that famous line, "I have played the fool." I was reading a well-known Bible teacher, scholar, preacher of another generation. Some of you know the name, J. Sidlow Baxter, and he was commenting on this particular statement by this particular man. And it was so powerful, I thought as my Sunday school lesson, I'd just pass it on to you, and hopefully it'll be as insightful for you as it was for me. He says, quote, "A man plays the fool when he neglects his godly friends as Saul neglected Samuel. A man plays the fool when he goes on enterprises for God before God has sent him, as Saul did. A man plays the fool when he disobeys God even in seemingly small matters. as Saul at first did. For such disobedience nearly always leads to worse default. A man plays the fool when he tries to cover up his disobedience to God by religious excuses, as Saul did. Samuel, of course, said to Saul early on, to obey is better than sacrifice, religious observances. A man plays the fool when he tries to persuade himself that he's doing the will of God, as Saul tried to persuade himself when all the time, deep down in his heart, he knows otherwise. A man plays the fool when he allows some jealousy or hatred to master and enslave and deprave him, as Saul did toward David. A man plays the fool when he knowingly fights against God, as Saul did in hunting David to save his own face. A man plays the fool when he turns from God, from the God he has grieved, and seeks an alternative in spiritism, in traffic with spirits, in the beyond. And he concludes, the end of all these ways of sin and folly is moral and spiritual suicide. We can only finish any such downgrade course with the pathetic groan of Saul, I have played the fool. Saul is a great bad example. Started well. We learn a lot from him. We're glad he's there. We're sorry for the way it turned out in his case, but it becomes a wonderful model for us to spot those areas where in any of our lives we are susceptible to beginning a path which would conclude with any of us saying to someone we love, I have played